The whistle of the Union Pacific train screamed like a dying man against the howling Wyoming wind, cutting through the silence of the Big Horn Basin. Silas Thorne stood on the platform, his hand resting near the Colt peacemaker on his hip, waiting for a woman he knew only through ink and paper. He thought he was there to pick up a bride, a Christmas wish to cure a lifetime of loneliness. But when the steam cleared and the iron wheels ground to a halt, Silas didn't just find a wife. He found a woman running for her life, clutching a carpet bag filled with secrets that would turn the snow-covered plains red with blood. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of how a Christmas wish became a fight for survival. The calendar on the wall of the station master's office read December 23rd, 1884. But out here in Silver Creek, Wyoming, dates didn't mean much. The only thing that mattered was the temperature, which had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero, and the wind, which carried the bite of the coming blizzard. Silas Thorne adjusted the brim of his black Stetson, pulling it lower to shield his eyes from the biting grit swirling in the air. He was a man built of rawhide and silence, 38 years old, with hands calloused from barbed wire and a face weathered by the unforgiving sun. He was the owner of the Double T Ranch, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land that right now was buried under 2 feet of snow. He wasn't a man given to nervousness. He had stared down rustlers in the canyon and tracked a cougar that had been killing his calves for 3 days straight. But standing on the warped wooden planks of the Silver Creek station, listening for the chug of the approaching locomotive, Silas felt a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with the cold. He reached into the breast pocket of his heavy shearling coat and touched the letter. The paper was worn soft from how many times he had read it. Dear Mr. Thorne, I am not afraid of the work. I am not afraid of the quiet. I only seek a place where the past cannot find me. If you will have me, I will be on the morning train 2 days before Christmas. Yours, Alice. Alice Vance. That was the name. They had exchanged letters for 6 months. He had told her about the ranch, the isolation, and the hard work. She had told him she was a seamstress from St. Louis, looking for a fresh start. But words on paper were easy to hide behind. The ground began to vibrate. A moment later, the high-pitched shriek of the train whistle echoed off the valley walls. The massive black engine of the Union Pacific tore through the white landscape, belching dark smoke that stained the pristine sky. Sparks flew from the wheels as the brakes locked, screeching in protest, until the beast came to a halt in front of the station. The doors hissed open. A few weary travelers stepped off, a drummer selling patent medicine, 2 miners heading up to the claims in Deadwood, and the station master, Old Man Miller, dragging mail sacks. Silas held his breath. Then she appeared. She stepped onto the metal grate of the train car, hesitating. She was wrapped in a charcoal-grey wool coat that looked too thin for Wyoming. A matching hat was pinned to chestnut hair that was escaping in the wind. Silas stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the packed snow. "Miss Vance!" Her head snapped up. Her eyes were green, striking and vivid, but filled with a frantic energy that stopped Silas cold. She didn't look like a blushing bride-to-be. She looked like a trapped animal. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was breathless, barely audible over the hissing steam. "It's Silas. Just Silas." He reached up a hand to help her down. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong, her leather glove cold against his skin. As she stepped down to the platform, she stumbled, nearly colliding with his chest. Silas caught her, steadying her by the elbows. That was when he felt it. She was trembling violently. "Easy now," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "The wind takes some getting used to." "It's not the wind," she whispered, her eyes darting to the windows of the train car she had just exited. We have to leave. Now. Please, Silas." Silas frowned, his instincts flaring. He looked past her, toward the train. Through the grime-streaked window of the passenger car, he saw a silhouette, a man in a bowler hat, watching them. As Silas made eye contact, the man slowly lowered the shade. "Who is that?" Silas asked, his tone hardening. "No questions," Alice begged, clutching her carpetbag so tight her knuckles were white through the leather. "You promised me safety. In your letters, you said the ranch was a fortress. Take me there." Silas looked at her, really looked at her. Beneath the fear, he saw exhaustion. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, and there was a tightness to her jaw that spoke of days without sleep. "The wagon is out back," Silas said, taking the bag from her hand. It was heavier than it looked. "Let's go." As they walked around the station building to where his team of Clydesdales was hitched, Silas glanced back one last time. The conductor was signaling the departure, but the man in the bowler hat hadn't stepped off. Yet, Silas felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the feeling of being hunted. He helped Alice onto the buckboard seat and wrapped a heavy buffalo robe around her. "Keep that tight. It's a 2-hour ride." "I don't care how long it takes," she said, her teeth chattering. "Just get me away from those tracks." Silas climbed up, grabbed the reins and snapped them. The horses lunged forward, pulling the wagon away from the station and toward the snowy expanse of the open range. As they crested the first hill, leaving the town of Silver Creek behind, Alice let out a long, shuddering breath. "I thought he would get off. I thought he would follow." Silas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the trail, scanning the ridgeline. "Who, Alice? A husband? A debt collector?" "A murderer," she said flatly. Silas pulled back on the reins, bringing the wagon to a slow halt in the middle of the snowy track. The silence of the plains washed over them. "I didn't sign up for a war, Miss Vance," Silas said quietly. "I asked for a wife." Alice turned to him, tears finally spilling over her frozen lashes. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, velvet-wrapped object. She unwrapped it to reveal a heavy, gold pocket watch with a cracked face. The back was engraved with the seal of the U.S. Marshals. "I didn't steal this," she said, her voice shaking. "I took it off the body of the man who was supposed to protect me. The man on the train. He's not a marshal. He's the one who killed him." Silas stared at the watch, then at the woman. The romantic notion of a Christmas wedding evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the frontier. He wasn't just a lonely rancher anymore. He was now the only thing standing between this woman and a grave. "Put it away," Silas commanded, snapping the reins again. "We make the ranch before sundown, and you better pray the snow covers our tracks." The ride to the Double T Ranch was grueling. The snow began to fall harder, large flakes that swirled in a mesmerizing dance, blinding them to anything more than 10 feet ahead. By the time the timber archway of the ranch gate loomed out of the whiteout, Silas's beard was frosted with ice, and Alice had stopped shivering, which was a dangerous sign of hypothermia. "We're here," Silas grunted, pulling the wagon up to the main house. It was a sturdy 2-story log structure, built to withstand the Wyoming winters. Smoke curled invitingly from the stone chimney. He didn't wait for her to move. He jumped down, his boots sinking into the drift, and walked around to her side. She was huddled under the buffalo robe, her eyes glassy. Silas scooped her up in his arms, buffalo robe and all, and kicked the front door open. The warmth hit them like a physical blow. The smell of burning pine and stewing beef filled the air. "Maud!" Silas bellowed. An older woman with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. Maud was the housekeeper, cook, and general matriarch of the Double T, since Silas's parents had passed. "Lord Almighty, Silas, don't shout the roof down," she scolded, but her eyes went wide when she saw the bundle in his arms. "Is that her?" "Get blankets, and whiskey, hot water," Silas ordered, carrying Alice to the large leather armchair by the fire. He set her down gently. Maud sprang into action. Within minutes, Alice was stripped of her wet coat and boots, wrapped in dry wool blankets, and holding a mug of hot tea laced with whiskey. The colour began to return to her cheeks. Silas stood by the fireplace, leaning his arm against the mantel, watching her. He had unbuckled his gun belt, but kept it within reach on the table. "You said murderer," Silas said, breaking the silence once Maud had retreated to the kitchen to fetch soup. "Start talking." Alice took a sip of the drink, wincing at the burn. "His name is Gideon Hayes. In St. Louis, he's a wealthy industrialist, owns half the shipping lines on the Mississippi." "And what is a seamstress doing with a shipping magnate?" Silas asked skeptically. "I wasn't just a seamstress," she admitted, looking down into her cup. "I was his bookkeeper for 3 years. I saw the numbers. He wasn't just shipping cotton and grain. He was moving stolen munitions, army supplies meant for the forts out west. He was selling them to private militias and others." Silas's eyes narrowed. This was bigger than a domestic dispute. This was treason. "I found the ledger," Alice continued, her voice gaining strength. "I tried to go to the authorities. I met a U.S. Marshal named Samuel Cole. He believed me. We were supposed to meet at the train station to hand over the evidence. But Hayes, he has eyes everywhere." She paused, swallowing hard. "I saw Hayes's man, a hired gun named Nero, stab Marshal Cole on the platform. I grabbed Cole's bag. He said the evidence was inside, and I jumped on the first moving train I saw. It was the Union Pacific heading west." "So you didn't come here for me?" Silas said, a bitter edge to his voice. "You came here because I was a convenient address in the middle of nowhere." Alice looked up, her green eyes fierce. "I wrote you those letters because I wanted to believe a life like this was possible, Silas. I wanted to believe there was a place where honor still mattered. When I got on that train, I didn't know where it was going until I checked the ticket I bought. I remembered your address. It was the only hope I had." Silas looked at the fire. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to tell her to get back on the wagon. But he looked at the fear in her face and the determination beneath it. He was a man who lived by a code. You don't turn away a horse in a storm, and you sure as hell don't turn away a woman running from a snake like Gideon Hayes. "This Nero?" Silas asked. "The man on the train?" "Yes. He has a scar running through his left eyebrow. He never smiles." Silas nodded. "I saw him. He didn't get off at Silver Creek." "He will," Alice said darkly. "He'll go to the next stop, realize I'm not on board, and double back. He's a tracker, Silas. He'll find me." "Not in this weather," Silas muttered. "The pass will be closed by morning. Nobody is getting in or out of the basin for at least 3 days." "That gives us 3 days," Alice said. "To do what?" "To survive," she whispered. Just then, the front door rattled. Not from the wind. Someone was pounding on it. Silas's hand moved to his Colt before he even processed the sound. He motioned for Alice to get down behind the chair. "Who is it?" Silas yelled. "Open up, Thorne! It's Bull!" Silas relaxed slightly. It was Sheriff Bull Caldwell. He holstered the gun and opened the door. The sheriff was a mountain of a man, covered in snow. He stomped inside, shaking off like a wet dog. "Hell of a night to be out, Bull," Silas said. "Hell of a night indeed," Bull grunted. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on Alice peering over the back of the chair. "So, the bride arrived. Congratulations." "Thank you, Sheriff," Alice said cautiously, standing up. Bull nodded, but his face was grim. He turned back to Silas. "I didn't ride out here in a blizzard to wish you a Merry Christmas, Silas. We got a telegram just before the lines went down an hour ago." Silas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "From who?" "St. Louis police," Bull said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "They're looking for a woman, Alice Vance, wanted for embezzlement and the murder of a U.S. Marshal." The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Silas looked at Alice. She didn't flinch. She stared right back at the sheriff. "It's a lie," Silas said calmly, stepping between Bull and Alice. Bull raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" "The description matches. And the telegram said she's armed and dangerous. Said she stole a ledger." "I have the ledger," Alice said, stepping out from behind Silas. "And it proves that Gideon Hayes is the traitor, not me. The sheriff in St. Louis is on Hayes's payroll." Bull looked from Silas to Alice. He had known Silas for 20 years. They had fought in the Indian Wars together. He knew Silas wasn't a fool. "Silas," Bull warned low in his throat, "if you harbor a fugitive, I gotta take you in too, even on Christmas." "She's my wife, Bull," Silas lied, his voice steady as a rock. "We married at the station. Justice of the Peace Miller did the honors." It was a reckless lie. Miller was the station master, not a JP, though he sometimes notarized papers. But in a blizzard, nobody could check. "So she's under my protection," Silas continued. "And if you want to take her, you have to go through me." Bull stared at him, chewing on his mustache. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Bull's hand hovered near his own gun. Finally, Bull sighed and dropped his hand. "The telegraph lines are down. Roads are closing. I can't take anyone to the county seat in this weather anyway." He turned to the door. "I'm going to head back to town before I freeze to death." "But Silas, there were 2 strangers asking about renting horses at the livery just before I left. Hard men. City clothes. Said they were looking for a lost relative." Silas's blood ran cold. Nero hadn't waited for the next stop. He had jumped the train early. "Thanks for the tip, Bull," Silas said. "Watch your back, Thorn," Bull said, opening the door to the swirling white hell outside. "I'll be back when the storm breaks. If she's lying, I'm coming for both of you." The door slammed shut. Silas turned to Alice. "He's here. Nero is here. And he's not alone." Alice moved to the window, peering out into the blackness. "What do we do?" Silas walked over to the gun cabinet on the far wall. He unlocked it, revealing a row of Winchester rifles and a double-barreled shotgun. "Maud!" he yelled toward the kitchen. "Get the shutters closed. Bar the doors." He tossed a Winchester 1873 to Alice. She caught it clumsily. "Do you know how to use that?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "You've got tonight to learn," Silas said, racking the lever of his own rifle. "Because come Christmas morning, we're going to have company." The wind howled against the log walls of the Double T like a pack of starving wolves, a relentless, shrieking reminder that death was waiting just outside the door. Inside, the only light came from the dying embers of the fireplace and the kerosene lamp on the heavy oak table. Silas stood behind Alice, his chest acting as a shield against the drafts that managed to sneak through the chinking. He could smell the scent of her, faint lavender soap and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. "Shoulder it tight," Silas instructed, his voice low and rough. "If you leave a gap, the recoil will bruise you black and blue." Alice gritted her teeth, pulling the stock of the Winchester 1873 into her shoulder. The rifle was heavy, smelling of gun oil and steel. It felt alien in her hands, hands that were used to embroidery needles and ledger pens, not instruments of death. "My hands are shaking," she whispered, frustration leaking into her voice. "Let them shake," Silas said. He reached around her, his large, rough hand covering hers on the forestock, steadying the barrel. "Just don't let your finger touch the trigger until you see what you need to hit." He guided her through the motion of racking the lever. Click-clack. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "Why are you doing this?" Alice asked, lowering the rifle for a moment to look back at him. The firelight caught the silver in his stubble and the deep lines etched around his eyes. "You could have handed me over to the sheriff. You could have saved your ranch the trouble." Silas took the rifle from her, checking the action with practiced ease. He walked to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters at the swirling white abyss. "I had a wife once," Silas said, the words coming out slow, like pulling teeth. "Mary. We were young. It was the winter of 7 A fever swept through the basin. We were snowed in, just like this. I couldn't get to town for the doctor. I watched the life fade out of her because I wasn't prepared. Because I couldn't fight the cold." He turned back to Alice, his dark eyes burning. "I swore then that I'd never let the elements, or any man, take something from me again without a fight. You came here asking for a home, Alice. You're under my roof. That makes you family. And the thorns protect their own." Alice felt a lump form in her throat. She stepped toward him, the distance between them closing. The tension in the room shifted from fear to something more electric. "I'm sorry about Mary," she said softly. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough wool of his sleeve. "I never wanted to bring a war to your door, Silas. I wanted the life you wrote about. The peace." "Peace is something you fight for," Silas murmured. He looked down at her, and for a moment the hardened cowboy vanished. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "If we survive this, if we get through Christmas, we'll talk about that life." Alice closed her eyes, breathing in his scent, smoke, leather, and safety. "When we survive," she corrected him. A sudden crash from the kitchen made them both jump. Silas spun around, the rifle instantly at his shoulder. "Maud," he called out. "It's just a pot, you nervous fools." Maud's voice rang out, though it wavered slightly. She marched into the living room, holding a tray of stale biscuits and coffee. "The wind blew the shutter open and knocked the pan off the hook. I fixed it." Silas lowered the gun, exhaling sharply. But the adrenaline didn't fade. It was a warning. The ranch wasn't a fortress. It was just wood and stone. And outside, the storm was beginning to break. "Eat," Maud commanded, setting the tray down. "You'll need your strength. The snow is stopping." Silas moved to the window again. Maud was right. The howling had died down to a low moan. The heavy curtain of snow was thinning. Through the gloom, the first grey light of Christmas Eve morning was creeping over the horizon. And with the light came footprints. Silas squinted. Far out, near the tree line, a dark shape moved against the white snow. Then another. "Lights out!" Silas hissed, extinguishing the lamp. "They're here." The silence of the morning was heavier than the storm. The sun rose over a landscape that looked like a jagged sheet of diamonds, blindingly white and deceptively peaceful. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. Silas crouched by the east window, the Winchester resting on the sill. Alice was at the west window with the shotgun, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Maud was in the kitchen, armed with a rusted navy revolver she had pulled from a flour sack. "Do you see them?" Alice whispered. "I count 4, Silas said, his voice flat. "They're spreading out. They want to flank us." Out on the snow-crusted yard, a man in a heavy fur coat stepped out from behind the barn. He held a repeating rifle in one hand and a white flag in the other. "That's Nero," Alice breathed, her grip tightening on the shotgun. Silas didn't move. "He wants to talk." "He wants to distract us," Alice countered. Nero's voice carried easily across the frozen air. It was a smooth, cultured baritone that didn't belong in the Wild West. "Mr. Thorne," Nero called out, his breath pluming in the air. "It's Christmas Eve. I have no quarrel with you. Send the girl out with the book, and we ride away. You go back to your cattle. No blood needs to be spilled on this holy day." Silas cracked the window open an inch. "You're trespassing, Nero. Turn around, or I bury you where you stand." Nero chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I was afraid you'd say that." He dropped the white flag. In the same second, the glass of the kitchen window exploded inward. Maud screamed. "Maud!" Alice yelled, abandoning her post to run toward the kitchen. "Stay down!" Silas roared, firing 3 rapid shots out the window. One of the men near the corral spun around, clutching his shoulder, staining the snow crimson. Alice slid into the kitchen on her knees. Maud was on the floor, clutching her arm. A splinter of wood from the window frame, driven by a bullet, had gouged her forearm. But she was alive. "I'm fine!" Maud yelled, struggling to sit up and raising her revolver. "Watch the back door!" The back door rattled violently as someone tried to kick it in. Alice scrambled up, leveled the shotgun at the heavy timber, and remembered Silas's words. "Don't flinch." She pulled the trigger. The boom was deafening in the confined space. The buckshot blew a hole through the wood, and a scream of pain erupted from the other side. "Reload!" Silas shouted from the other room, his rifle cracking again and again. The ranch house had become a war zone. Bullets thudded into the thick logs, sending splinters flying. Glass shattered. The smell of gunpowder replaced the smell of coffee. Silas was a machine. He moved from window to window, firing with terrifying precision. He wasn't shooting to scare. He was shooting to kill. He dropped a second man who tried to rush the porch. "That's 2 down!" Silas yelled. "Keep their heads down, Alice!" Alice grabbed a handful of shells from her pocket, her fingers fumbling. She managed to reload the shotgun, just as a shadow crossed the broken kitchen window. She fired blindly, blasting the frame, forcing the attacker back. Suddenly, the shooting stopped. The silence rushed back in, ringing in their ears. "Why did they stop?" Alice gasped, her chest heaving. Silas crawled over to her, checking Maud's arm quickly. "Tie that off," he ordered Maud. Then he looked at Alice, his face grim. "They're not retreating. They're changing tactics." "What do you mean?" Silas sniffed the air. His eyes widened. "Smoke." "They're burning the barn?" Alice asked, horrified. The horses were in there. "No," Silas said, looking at the floorboards. "They threw something onto the roof. They're trying to smoke us out." Above them, the distinct crackle of dry wood catching fire began to grow. The roof shingles, dried out by years of sun, were catching fast. "We can't stay in here," Silas said, grabbing a box of ammunition. "If we stay, we burn. If we go out, they cut us down." "The root cellar," Maud rasped, wincing as she tightened a rag around her arm. "Access is from the pantry. It's stone-lined. The fire won't reach us." "It's a trap," Silas said. "If the house collapses on top of it, we're buried alive." "It's better than burning," Alice said, coughing as the first wisps of grey smoke curled down from the ceiling. "Go," Silas ordered. "Get Maud down there. Take the ledger. I'll cover you." "You're coming too." Alice grabbed his arm. "I have to buy you time to get the trap door open. Go!" Silas shoved her gently toward the pantry. Alice helped Maud up, and they scrambled into the pantry. Alice heaved the heavy rug aside and yanked the iron ring of the trapdoor. It groaned open, revealing the dark, cool space below. She helped Maud down the ladder. She looked back. Silas was at the window, firing a suppressive volley to keep Nero's men pinned. "Silas!" she screamed. The ceiling in the living room groaned. A burning beam crashed down, blocking the path between them. A wall of fire roared to life, separating the cowboy from the woman he had sworn to protect. "Silas!" "Close the door, Alice." Silas's voice came from behind the wall of flames. "I'll find another way. Close it!" Alice hesitated, tears streaming down her face, stinging from the smoke. "Do it!" She slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the bolt, plunging them into darkness. Above them, the house began to die. Hours passed in the suffocating dark of the root cellar. The air grew hot and stale. Above them, the roaring of the fire eventually subsided to a sporadic crackling and the heavy thuds of collapsing timber. Alice sat huddled against a pickle barrel, holding Maud's hand. The older woman was feverish, her breathing shallow. "He's gone," Alice whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "He didn't make it out." "Don't you bet against Silas Thorne," Maud wheezed in the dark. "That boy is too stubborn to die." Suddenly there was a sound. Not the fire. The sound of boots crunching on debris above the trapdoor. Alice grabbed the shotgun, pointing it at the ceiling. She had 2 shells left. "Open it up," a muffled voice commanded. It wasn't Silas. It was Nero. "If you don't open it, Miss Vance, I'll drop a stick of dynamite down the vent pipe," Nero said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I know you're down there. The fire didn't burn hot enough to melt stone." Alice looked at Maud. There was no choice. "I'm coming out," Alice yelled. "Don't shoot." "Leave the gun," Nero replied. Alice set the shotgun down. She clutched the carpetbag containing the ledger to her chest. She climbed the ladder and pushed the trapdoor up. Daylight flooded in, harsh and grey. The ranch house was gone. Only the stone chimney and the foundation remained. Smoke drifted lazily from the blackened ruins. Nero stood there, flanked by 2 men who looked battered and bloody. Nero himself had a bandage wrapped around his head, staining the white gauze red. "Help her up," Nero gestured to his men. They hauled Alice out of the hole, then reached down to drag Maud out. They threw the older woman onto the snow like a sack of feed. "Maud!" Alice cried, rushing to her, but one of the men backhanded her across the face. She fell into the ash, tasting blood. Nero walked over and snatched the carpetbag from Alice's grip. He opened it, rifling through the papers until he found the thick, leather-bound ledger. He smiled, a terrifying expression that didn't reach his eyes. "All this trouble for some numbers," Nero sighed. He tossed the bag into the smouldering ruins of the house. He held the ledger up. "Mr. Hayes will be very pleased." "Where is he?" Alice demanded, wiping blood from her lip. "Where is Silas?" Nero looked around the ruins. "If he was in there, he's ash now. If he got out, well, my men are watching the perimeter. He won't get far." Nero pulled a heavy revolver from his coat. He walked over to Alice, towering over her. "You're a loose end, Miss Vance, and I don't like loose ends." He cocked the hammer. "Wait!" Alice screamed. "You have the book. You have what you want." "True," Nero mused, "but you've seen my face, and you've seen the face of the man who hired me." He raised the gun to her forehead. Alice squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the flash. Crack! The sound wasn't a pistol shot. It was the sharp, distinctive retort of a Winchester rifle from a distance. Nero's gun flew out of his hand, spinning into the snow, his fingers shattered. He screamed, clutching his mangled hand to his chest. "Take cover!" one of the henchmen yelled. Alice opened her eyes. Up on the ridge, 300 yards away, a figure sat atop a horse. A black Stetson, a shearling coat. Silas. He racked the lever of his rifle, the sound echoing across the valley. He wasn't dead, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, riding out of the tree line, were 5 other riders. They wore heavy coats and stars pinned to their chests. "Drop your weapons," a voice boomed, the deep, thunderous voice of Sheriff Bull Caldwell. Silas had escaped the fire. He hadn't just run, he had gone for help. He had ridden through the tail end of the storm, through the night, to get the sheriff. "Kill her!" Nero shrieked at his men, his face contorted in pain. "Kill them both!" The two henchmen raised their rifles toward Alice and Maud. Alice didn't think. She dove on top of Maud, shielding the older woman with her body. The air filled with lead. The valley exploded into chaos. The crack of Winchester rifles from the ridge line echoed like thunder rolling across the basin. Alice stayed flat against the cold, wet ground, her body shielded by the stone foundation of the ruined chimney. Underneath her, Maud groaned, clutching her injured arm, but she was alive. Above them, bullets hissed through the air, biting into the snow and ricocheting off the stone. "Stay down!" Alice screamed, pressing Maud's head lower. Up on the slope, Silas didn't stop. He kicked his black gelding into a gallop, charging down the slick, snowy incline with a reckless fury that terrified even the sheriff. He held the reins in his teeth, his rifle in one hand and his Colt peacemaker in the other. He wasn't fighting like a lawman. He was fighting like a man whose entire world was burning. Nero's henchmen, realizing they were outgunned and flanked, panicked. One tried to mount his horse, but a shot from Sheriff Bull Caldwell took the animal out from under him. The horse reared and fell, trapping the man's leg. "Surrender!" Bull bellowed, his voice booming over the gunfire. "Throw down your arms." One of the henchmen threw his rifle into the snow, raising his hands. But the other, the one who had struck Alice, wasn't ready to give up. He leveled his pistol at the charging rider. Silas saw the movement. He didn't hesitate. He fired his Colt from 40 yards out, a nearly impossible shot, while riding a galloping horse. The bullet struck the gunman in the chest. The man crumpled backward into a snowdrift, a patch of red blooming instantly on his coat. Silas reined his horse in hard as he reached the ruins of the house, the animal's hooves kicking up a cloud of ash and ice. He vaulted from the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "Alice!" he roared, scanning the debris. "We're here!" Alice called out, pushing herself up from behind the chimney. Relief washed over Silas's face, raw and visible. He took a step toward her, lowering his gun. "Silas, look out!" Maud screamed from the ground. Silas spun around. Nero wasn't dead. The shot to his hand had maimed him, and he was pale from shock and blood loss, but he was still the most dangerous man in the territory. He had crawled through the smoke and debris to the edge of the burning foundation. With his good left hand, he had pulled a sawed-off shotgun from beneath his coat. He lay on his back in the ash, a twisted smile on his face, the barrels leveled directly at Silas's chest from 10 feet away. "Merry Christmas, Cowboy," Nero wheezed. Time seemed to freeze. Silas couldn't raise his Colt fast enough. The sheriff and his men were too far up the hill to get a clear shot without hitting Silas. Alice saw it all unfold. She saw the malice in Nero's eyes. She saw the hopelessness in Silas's stance. She didn't think about fear. She didn't think about the cold. Her hand closed around a jagged, heavy piece of burnt timber lying in the rubble next to her. With a guttural cry of pure rage, Alice lunged. She didn't run away. She ran toward the danger. She swung the heavy timber with both hands, bringing it down with all her strength on Nero's outstretched arm, just as his finger tightened on the trigger. Boom! The shotgun went off, but the blow had knocked Nero's aim wild. The buckshot tore harmlessly into the sky, shredding the branch of a nearby pine tree. Nero howled in agony as the wood shattered his wrist. Before he could recover, a shadow fell over him. Silas stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. He kicked the shotgun away into the snow. Then he placed the barrel of his peacemaker against Nero's forehead. "Give me a reason," Silas growled, his voice trembling with the adrenaline of a man who had almost lost everything. "Please, give me one reason." Nero looked up, eyes wide, breathing hard. He looked at Silas, then at Alice, who stood panting, her face smeared with soot, holding the piece of wood like a club. He saw something in their eyes that terrified him more than the gun. "I yield," Nero whispered, slumping back into the ash. Silas held the gun there for a long second. His finger whitened on the trigger. The desire to pull it, to end the threat forever, was a physical weight in his chest. "Silas." Alice's voice was soft, cutting through the ringing in his ears. She stepped closer and placed her hand on his gun arm. "It's over," she said. "Don't let him turn you into a killer. Not on Christmas." Silas looked at her. He saw the soot on her cheeks, the tear in her coat, the fire in her green eyes. He slowly let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since he saw the smoke from the ridge. He uncocked the hammer. "Bull!" Silas yelled without looking away from Nero. "Get some irons on this trash before I change my mind." Sheriff Caldwell and his deputies rode into the yard, guns drawn. They swarmed Nero and the surviving henchmen, hauling them roughly out of the debris. Silas holstered his gun. He turned to Alice. For a moment, they just stared at each other amidst the ruins of his life's work. The house was gone. The barn was scorched. But the silence that followed was the sweetest sound Silas had ever heard. He reached out, grabbing her by the waist, and pulled her into him. He buried his face in her neck, holding her so tight it almost hurt. Alice wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, sobbing into his shearling coat. "I thought you were dead," she cried. "I told you," Silas murmured into her hair. "The thorns protect their own." The silence that descended upon the Big Horn Basin was absolute. Minutes ago, the air had been torn apart by the thunder of Winchester rifles and the screams of dying men. Now the only sound was the crackling hiss of the Double T ranch house settling into a heap of smouldering charcoal, and the heavy, labored breathing of the survivors. Silas Thorne sat on an overturned crate near the edge of the ruin, his hands hanging loosely between his knees. The adrenaline that had fueled his mad charge down the ridge was draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He watched the smoke drift lazily toward the grey sky, carrying with it the memories of 3 generations of thorns. The heavy timber beams his grandfather had hewn by hand were gone. The table where his mother had taught him to read was ash. The physical history of his life had been erased in less than an hour. Yet, as he looked down at his trembling hands, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loss he expected. He felt a strange, vibrating clarity. A few yards away, Sheriff Bull Caldwell was tightening the cinch on his saddle. His deputies were busy hoisting Nero, barely conscious and moaning from his shattered hand, onto a spare horse, tying his feet beneath the belly of the animal. The other surviving gunman sat in the snow, wrists bound, staring blankly at the ground. Alice stood near the remnants of the porch. She had wrapped a grey wool blanket around her shoulders, covering the torn and soot-stained coat that had been her armor. Her face was smudged with black ash, her hair wild and tangled, but her green eyes were sharp, fixed on Silas. She looked like a statue carved from resilience and regret. Bull walked over to Silas, his boots crunching loudly on the packed snow. He held the leather-bound ledger in his hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. "You know what this is, Silas?" Bull asked, his voice low and gravelly. Silas looked up, squinting against the glare of the snow. "Trouble." "Justice," Bull corrected him. I took a look while the boys were securing the prisoners. This isn't just shipping manifests. It's names, dates, payoffs to senators, railroad tycoons, and the St. Louis Police Commissioner. Bull looked over at Alice, a newfound respect in his eyes. That little lady over there didn't just steal a book. She stole Gideon Hayes's entire empire. When this hits the federal judge in Cheyenne, Hayes won't be sending any more hired guns. He'll be fighting to keep his neck out of a noose. So she's clear? Silas asked, the tension in his shoulders knitting tight again. Locally? Yes, Bull nodded. I'll deputize her retroactively if I have to. Self-defense covers the marshal, considering Nero just confessed to pulling the trigger while begging for morphine. But she'll need to testify. It's going to be a long winter of depositions. Bull paused, tilting his hat back. I'll need to file a report on the property damage, and on the residents. How do you want me to list her? Silas? Witness? Fugitive? Or family? Silas looked at Alice. She had turned away, staring at the blackened foundation of the house, shivering slightly in the wind. She's family, Bull, Silas said, his voice firm. Put her down as a resident of the Double T. I was hoping you'd say that, Bull grinned, a flash of white teeth under his bushy mustache. I never did like seeing a man ride the range alone. The sheriff mounted his horse, the leather creaking in the cold air. He signaled to his deputies. We'll take these trash back to town. I'll wire the marshals in Cheyenne tonight. And Silas, I'll send Doc Baker out with a wagon of supplies tomorrow. You're going to need nails and lumber if you plan on beating the next blizzard. Obliged, Sheriff, Silas nodded. With a tip of his hat and a sharp whistle, Bull Caldwell led the posse out of the yard. The horses plodded through the deep snow, dragging the defeated mercenaries back to civilization, leaving the three survivors alone in the vast, silent wilderness. Silas stood up, his knees popping. He walked over to Maud, who was sitting on a stump, clutching her bandaged arm. You all right, old girl? He asked gently. Maud huffed, though her face was pale. I've had worse from a cranky mule, but my kitchen is gone, Silas. My cast-iron skillet, it was seasoned for 20 years. We'll get you a new one, Silas promised. Better yet, we'll get you a stove that doesn't smoke. Go check on her. Maud jerked her chin toward Alice. She looks like she's about to break. Silas nodded and walked across the yard. The snow was beginning to fall again, large, soft flakes that hissed as they hit the hot embers of the house. Alice didn't hear him approach until he was right beside her. She jumped slightly, then wrapped her arms tighter around herself. She wouldn't look at him. It's all gone, she whispered, her voice cracking. Everything. Because of me. Alice! No, Silas, look at it! She spun to face him, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. You had a life here. You had a home. I brought death to your doorstep. I brought fire. I destroyed everything you worked for. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a handful of crumpled bills, her life savings, meant for a new start. She tried to shove them into his chest. Take it, she sobbed. It's not enough to pay for the house, but it's all I have. I'll go with the supply wagon when it comes tomorrow. I'll go to Cheyenne and testify, and then I'll disappear. You won't ever have to see me again. Silas caught her wrists, stopping her frantic movements. His grip was strong, unyielding. Stop, he commanded, not angrily, but with a force that silenced her. He looked at the money in her hands, then at the ruins behind her. He released her wrists and turned toward the wreckage. He walked a few steps into the ash, ignoring the heat radiating through the soles of his boots. He bent down and picked something up from what used to be the mantelpiece. It was a jagged piece of blue ceramic, a shard of a vase his grandmother had brought over on a wagon train from Virginia. He walked back to Alice and held it out. "You see this?" Silas asked. Alice nodded, sniffing. "This is just a thing," Silas said, tossing the shard over his shoulder into the snow. "And that house? It was just wood and stone. Wood rots. Stone cracks. I've spent 10 years in that house, Alice, and I've never felt more cold than I did sitting by that fire alone." He stepped closer, invading her space, forcing her to look up at him. The wind whipped his coat around his legs, but he felt warm. "You didn't destroy my life," Silas said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "You saved it." Alice blinked, confusion warring with the guilt in her eyes. "I don't understand. I almost got you killed." "A man can be breathing and still be dead," Silas replied. "I've been a ghost on this ranch since Mary died, just working, sleeping, and waiting for the winter to end. When I saw you step off that train, when I saw you fight for your life in that station, I remembered what it felt like to have blood in my veins. I remembered what it felt like to have something worth fighting for." He reached into the breast pocket of his shearling coat. For a second, Alice thought he was reaching for tobacco. Instead, he pulled out a folded, charred piece of paper. The edges were burnt, and it smelled of smoke. It was her first letter. "Read the last line," Silas said, handing it to her. Alice took it with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the familiar script, the ink slightly run from the snow. "If you will have me, I will be on the morning train 2 days before Christmas. Yours, Alice." "I didn't know who was coming on that train," Silas said. "I thought maybe a woman who wanted a cook's job, or someone running from a debt. I didn't expect a partner." He took her cold, gloved hands in his large, calloused ones. "I'm going to rebuild this house," Silas stated, a fierce determination in his eyes. "I'm going to cut the timber from the north ridge. I'm going to lay a foundation deeper than the last one. But a house is just a box to keep the wind out, unless there's a reason to come inside." He squeezed her hands. "I don't want you to leave, Alice. Not for Cheyenne. Not for St. Louis. I want you to stay. I want you to help me build it." Alice searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any sign that he was just being kind to a woman in distress. She saw nothing but the hard, honest truth of the frontier. She saw a man who had faced death an hour ago and chosen life. "I don't know the first thing about ranching," she admitted, a small, watery smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "And I'm a terrible cook. Maud will tell you." "I can teach you to ride," Silas smiled, the expression transforming his rugged face. "And Maud isn't going anywhere. Besides, I need someone who can handle a Winchester and balance the books. Seems to me you're overqualified." Alice laughed then, a sound that broke the tension of the afternoon. It was a sound of relief, of release. She looked at the ruins one last time, but now, instead of seeing a graveyard, she saw a blank canvas. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Silas." Silas didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He pulled her into him, wrapping his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the snowy ground. He kissed her, not with the desperation of the battle, but with the slow, deliberate passion of a man claiming his future. Her lips were cold, tasting of salt and smoke, but to Silas, they tasted like Christmas. The snow fell heavier around them, turning the blackened scars of the fire into a pristine white blanket. The world was resetting. The violence of the morning was being buried under the promise of the afternoon. "Come on," Silas said, breaking the kiss but keeping her close. "It's freezing out here, and Maud is probably already complaining that the bunkhouse stove is too small. "Wait," Alice said, reaching up to brush a flake of ash from his cheek. "It's Christmas Day, Silas. We missed it." Silas looked toward the horizon, where the winter sun was beginning its early descent behind the Tetons, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold. "No," Silas said, looking back at the woman who had stepped off the morning train and turned his world upside down. "I reckon I got exactly what I asked for." They turned and walked toward the bunkhouse, arm in arm, leaving 2 sets of footprints in the fresh snow, not side by side as strangers, but in step as partners. The double T had fallen, but the thorns were just getting started. And as the door to the bunkhouse closed behind them, shutting out the cold, the warm glow of a lantern flickered in the window, a solitary beacon of hope in the vast, wild West. Silas and Alice rebuilt the double T, stone by stone. They married the following spring, right there on the new porch, with Sheriff Bull Caldwell standing as the best man and Maud crying in the front row. Gideon Hayes was hanged for treason, and the West moved on, as it always does. But in the valleys of Wyoming, folks still tell the story of the Christmas of '84, the year the snow turned red, and a seamstress and a cowboy showed the world that the only thing stronger than fear is love. Silas and Alice survived the winter, but the scars they carry are the price of freedom in the West. That is the brutal reality of the frontier. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't peace, but having someone worth fighting for when the war comes to your door. If you enjoyed this gritty tale of survival, romance, and justice, please hit the like button. It helps us bring more of these lost legends to life. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of the American frontier. And tell me in the comments, would you have boarded that train if you were in Alice's shoes? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next ride.